Finally, AOC faces criminal charges. Bondi delivers the final blow. Washington, D.C. had witnessed countless political scandals, corruption, bribery, cover-ups. None of it was new, but this time was different. This wasn't a Senate hearing or a partisan showdown on the House floor. This was a courtroom, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wasn't just another politician defending a policy. She was a defendant in a criminal case. The grand halls of the federal courthouse pulsed with an energy not felt in years. Protesters lined the sidewalks, their chants splitting the air, half demanding justice, half rallying in her defense. Inside, journalists filled the seats, their pens poised, cameras rolling. This was more than a trial. It was political theater at its highest level. AOC stepped out. Of the black SUV, her expression unreadable. The weight of the moment was clear, but she had mastered the art of composure. Clad in a sleek navy blazer, she embodied the fighter her supporters believed her to be. But today, the battlefield wasn't Congress. It was a court of law. At the prosecution's table sat Pam Bondi, the relentless former attorney general turned federal prosecutor. She wasn't here for headlines. She was here to win. Seated beside her was Caroline Leavitt, a rising star in conservative media, shaping the public narrative before a verdict was even reached. The judge entered, a stern, no-nonsense figure with a reputation for impartiality and little patience for political theatrics. He tapped his gavel. Court is now in session. Pam Bondi stood, her voice crisp and unwavering. Your Honor, the United States government brings charges against Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to aid individuals in evading federal law enforcement. The evidence will show that the defendant did not merely advocate for immigration reform. She actively encouraged illegal immigrants to defy lawful orders and evade deportation. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. AOC remained still, her face impassive. Bondi continued. This is not a case about politics. This is about the law. No one is above it. Not a senator, not a congresswoman, not even a self-proclaimed champion of justice. She took her seat, the tension thickening. AOC's defense attorney, James Calloway, rose. Unlike Bondi's sharp delivery, his voice was steady, deliberate. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution will try to convince you that my client is a criminal, that standing up for people's rights is a crime. But let's be clear. What Representative Ocasio-Cortez did was inform individuals of their constitutional protections. That is not obstruction. That is democracy. He turned to the jury, his gaze unwavering. If the government can prosecute someone for educating people about their rights, where does it end? Will lawyers be arrested for advising their clients? Will journalists be jailed for reporting on constitutional protections? Today, you are not just deciding the fate of my client. You are deciding the limits of free speech itself. He returned to his seat. AOC exhaled slowly, her posture still poised. The judge surveyed the room. The prosecution may call its first witness. Pam Bondi stood. The government calls Special Agent Daniel Briggs. A tall, broad-shouldered man in an ICE uniform walked to the stand. He took the oath, his movements deliberate, his expression unreadable. Agent Briggs, Bondi began, can you describe your role in immigration enforcement? Briggs nodded. I oversee operations targeting high-priority deportation cases. My unit specializes in locating individuals with outstanding removal orders. Bondi walked to the evidence table, lifting a thick folder. Were you involved in any operations directly impacted by the defendant's actions? Briggs's jaw tightened. Yes, he replied. During a raid targeting a known felon with an active deportation order, our agents arrived at his residence. We had confirmation he was inside, but he refused to open the door. Instead, he was seen on his phone, reading from a document. Bondi turned to the jury. And what was this document? Briggs's expression hardened. A step-by-step guide on how to avoid ICE, he said. It was part of a Know Your Rights pamphlet distributed through Representative Ocasio-Cortez's office. A hush fell over the room. Bondi took a step forward. So you're telling this court that the defendant's materials directly led to a target evading federal authorities? Briggs met her gaze. Yes, he confirmed. Not just that night. Since her. And the trial unfolds. As the courtroom absorbed Briggs's testimony, his final words hung in the air like a loaded silence. Since her materials began circulating, we've seen a measurable increase in resistance during enforcement operations. Pam Bondi let the statement settle before stepping back to the prosecution's table. She turned to the judge. No further questions. James Calloway rose smoothly, adjusting his suit jacket as he approached the stand. Agent Briggs, how many years have you worked in law enforcement? 15, Briggs answered. Calloway nodded. And, in those 15 years, are you aware that the Fourth Amendment protects individuals from unlawful searches and seizures? Briggs hesitated before answering. Yes. Calloway took a step closer. Did your team have a judicial warrant to enter the residence? Briggs's jaw tightened. No. It was an administrative order. Calloway spread his hands. So let's be clear. The individual in question exercised his legal right to refuse entry to law enforcement without a judicial warrant. Is that correct? Briggs hesitated again. Technically, yes. Calloway turned to the jury, his voice calm yet pointed. Ladies and gentlemen, the government wants you to believe that my client obstructed justice. But in reality, she simply told people the truth. If law enforcement does not have a judicial warrant, they cannot enter your home. That is not obstruction. That is the law. He turned back to the witness. One last question, Agent Briggs. Did Representative Ocasio-Cortez ever instruct anyone to resist arrest? Briggs exhaled sharply. Not explicitly. Calloway arched a brow. Not explicitly, or not at all. Briggs shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Not at all. Calloway faced the jury once more. No further questions. Bondi clenched her jaw. The first battle had not gone entirely in her favor, but she was far from finished. Judge Whitaker tapped his gavel. We will recess for lunch. Court will resume in 1 hour. As the courtroom emptied, AOC leaned toward Calloway. How bad was it? She whispered. Calloway smirked. Let's just say they took the first swing, but we're still standing. Across the room, Caroline Levitt leaned into Bondi. We need to hit harder. Bondi's eyes stayed locked on AOC. Oh, we will. This was only the beginning. The second witness and the yar-yar. Courtroom doors swung open as recess ended, and the tension in the air was heavier than before. Pam Bondi, more determined than ever, rose to her feet. Your Honor, the prosecution calls our next witness, Officer Michael Reynolds. A uniformed officer stepped forward, taking the oath before settling into the witness chair. His expression was firm. He was ready. Bondi approached the stand. Officer, Reynolds, can you explain your role in enforcing immigration policies? Reynolds nodded. I work with local law enforcement on federal immigration detainment efforts. Our job is to locate and apprehend individuals under deportation orders. Bondi took a breath, then locked eyes with him. Were there instances where Representative Ocasio-Cortez's statements directly impacted your operations? Reynolds hesitated, glancing briefly at AOC before answering. Yes, several. Bondi took a step closer. Tell the jury about one specific case. Reynolds exhaled. Last October, we received intelligence about a group of undocumented individuals hiding in an apartment complex. When we arrived, we found a crowd blocking our access. Many of them were citing statements directly from Representative Ocasio-Cortez's webinar. They refused to comply, claiming we had no legal right to detain anyone without a signed judicial warrant. Bondi folded her arms. And did you have such a warrant? Reynolds's grip tightened on the witness stand. No, he admitted. It was an administrative removal order. Bondi nodded. And what happened next? Reynolds' jaw tensed. We attempted to de-escalate the situation, but the resistance grew. By the time we got through, the targets had disappeared. It was clear they had been tipped off. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Bondi turned to the jury. Officer Reynolds, in your professional opinion, did Representative Ocasio-Cortez's rhetoric encourage these individuals to evade ICE? Reynolds didn't hesitate this time. Yes, he said firmly. Her materials and statements embolden resistance. They paint law enforcement as oppressors rather than protectors. Bondi nodded, her expression unreadable. No further questions. Calloway stood, buttoning his jacket as he approached the stand, his voice measured and deliberate. "Officer Reynolds, you said your team didn't have a judicial warrant, correct?" Reynolds hesitated. "Correct." Calloway tilted his head slightly. "So you expected people to willingly comply with a removal order that lacked," and the courtroom battle continued. Shifting the narrative, Calloway faced Reynolds, his expression calm but unwavering. The legal authority of a judge's signature. Reynolds frowned. It was still a lawful order. Calloway turned to the jury, his voice deliberate. Lawful in the eyes of ICE. Not in the eyes of the Constitution. He returned his attention to Reynolds. "Tell me, officer, were these individuals violent? Did they attack your officers?" Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "No. They stood their ground, but they did not initiate violence." Calloway nodded. "So they asserted their legal rights. Peacefully." Reynolds hesitated, realizing the trap. "Yes." Calloway took a measured step back. "Officer, are you aware that legal aid organizations have distributed Know Your Rights pamphlets for years? Have they ever been accused of obstruction?" Reynolds exhaled. "Not to my knowledge." Calloway spread his hands. "Yet when Representative Ocasio-Cortez does the same, it suddenly becomes a crime?" Reynolds glanced at Bondi, but she remained silent. "I'm just saying her influence made things harder for us," he muttered. Calloway nodded. "That's fair. But making your job harder doesn't make someone a criminal." He turned to the jury. No further questions. Reynolds stepped down, his expression tight. Bondi clenched her jaw. She had more evidence, but Calloway had just reframed the entire narrative. She needed something stronger. Judge Whitaker exhaled. "Prosecution. Do you wish to call another witness?" Bondi stood, her voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor, the government calls Caroline Leavitt." A ripple of surprise ran through the courtroom. Caroline Leavitt, a known media strategist, strode toward the witness stand. AOC's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just legal. This was about controlling the public perception. Leavitt took her oath and sat down. Bondi wasted no time. "Miss Leavitt, you've worked in media and political strategy for years. How would you describe Representative Ocasio-Cortez's influence?" Leavitt leaned forward slightly. "Massive. Her words don't just reach thousands. They reach millions. She's a brand. And when she tells people to resist, they listen." Bondi nodded. "And what impact does that have?" Leavitt smirked. "Chaos. Look at social media. The moment she tweets about ICE, protests erupt. Officers get doxxed. Public trust in law enforcement erodes." AOC stiffened. She knew Leavitt was a master at twisting narratives. Bondi continued, pressing forward. "In your experience, has Representative Ocasio-Cortez's messaging encouraged illegal resistance?" Leavitt nodded. "Absolutely. She crafts her statements in a way that shields her legally but sends a clear message to her audience. Resist, obstruct, don't comply." Bondi turned to the jury. No further questions. Counterattack. Calloway rose, adjusting his tie as he approached. "Miss Leavitt, you claim my client carefully crafts her words. Would you say you do the same in your media appearances?" Leavitt smirked. Of course, that's my job." Calloway nodded. "So when you go on national television and call my client a criminal mastermind, that's also a crafted statement?" The smirk faded slightly. "It's an opinion." Calloway stepped forward. "Miss Leavitt, isn't it true that you have personally profited from spreading anti-AOC narratives?" Leavitt stiffened. "I work in the media." Calloway nodded. "And controversy drives ratings, correct?" Leavitt hesitated. "Sometimes." Calloway turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard from a media strategist whose job is to shape public opinion. But opinion is not fact. An opinion does not belong in this courtroom." He turned back to Leavitt. No further questions. "The battle escalates." Bondi exhaled as Leavitt stepped down. The battle was escalating. The prosecution had landed punches. But Calloway had countered each one. Judge Whitaker glanced at the clock. We'll adjourn for the day. Court resumes tomorrow. As the courtroom emptied, Bondi leaned in toward Leavitt. We need to go harder. Leavitt smirked. Don't worry. By tomorrow, the country will believe she's guilty before the jury even decides. Across the room, AOC sat with Calloway, her fingers tapping lightly against the table. They're not just trying to win the trial, she muttered. They're trying to destroy me. Calloway nodded. Then we'd better be ready. The next morning, the courtroom was packed once again. Overnight, media outlets had dissected every word of the proceedings. Outside, protesters clashed, their chants echoing through the streets. Inside, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat motionless, steeling herself for what was coming next. Judge Whitaker lifted his gavel. Court is now in session, and the war of narratives continued. The courtroom battle intensifies. The judge raised his gavel and brought it down with a firm strike. Court is now in session. Prosecution, you may continue. Pam Bondi stood, her expression sharper than ever. Your Honor, the government calls Mark Harris, a former staffer from Representative Ocasio-Cortez's office. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. At the defense table, AOC's posture stiffened slightly. She knew Harris well. He had worked on immigration outreach for a short time, before his sudden resignation. Now she was about to find out why. Harris stepped onto the stand, his movements tense but composed. After taking the oath, Bondi approached. Mr. Harris, can you describe your role in Representative Ocasio-Cortez's office? Harris cleared his throat. I assisted in organizing community outreach events, particularly those focused on immigration rights. Bondi nodded. And during your time there, did you ever feel that the messaging around these events crossed a legal boundary? Harris hesitated, his gaze flicking toward AOC. There were times when I felt we were walking a fine line. Bondi's eyes gleamed. Explain. Harris exhaled slowly. We weren't just educating people about their rights. We were advising them on how to avoid ICE entirely. There were meetings where we discussed strategies to ensure that law enforcement wouldn't be able to detain undocumented individuals. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Bondi let the weight of his words settle before pressing forward. So, in your professional opinion, was this legal guidance or was this obstruction? Harris hesitated, his jaw tightening before he answered. It felt like obstruction. Bondi turned to the jury. No further questions. The counterattack, James Calloway, rose slowly, adjusting his tie as he approached the stand. His expression remained unreadable, his voice calm. Mr. Harris, let's be clear. You said that during your time in AOC's office you worked on immigration outreach? Yes. Calloway nodded. And did Representative Ocasio-Cortez ever instruct anyone to lie to law enforcement? Harris shook his head. No. Calloway took a step closer. Did she ever tell anyone to use false identities? No. Calloway spread his hands. So, when you say it felt like obstruction, you're basing that purely on perception, not on any direct illegal instruction. From my client? Harris shifted uncomfortably. I guess so. Calloway nodded. One last question. You resigned from AOC's office, correct? Yes. Was that before or after you received an offer from a conservative policy group? Silence. Harris's face paled. Objection, Bondi snapped. Relevance. Judge Whitaker turned to Calloway. Where are you going with this, counselor? Calloway folded his hands. Your Honor, the jury has the right to know if this witness has a financial or political motivation for his testimony. The judge considered for a moment before nodding. I'll allow it. Answer the question, Mr. Harris. Harris shifted in his seat, visibly uneasy. Calloway let the silence stretch before turning to the jury. No further questions. Escalation. Bondi clenched her jaw as Harris stepped down. She had landed a strong blow, but Calloway had made sure it didn't land as hard as she wanted. Judge Whitaker scanned the room. We will reconvene after a brief recess. As the courtroom emptied, Caroline Leavitt leaned toward Bondi. We need something bigger. Bondi exhaled, her mind racing. We'll get it. Across the room, AOC turned to Calloway. "They're throwing everything." "They have." Calloway smirked. "Good. That means they're worried. The prosecution strikes again." When court reconvened, the tension was sharper than before. The prosecution had made gains, but they needed a decisive moment. Pam Bondi was about to give them one. She stood, her voice steady. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Officer Luis Mendoza." A uniformed officer stepped up to the witness stand, his expression unreadable. He took the oath, then Bondi approached. "Officer Mendoza, you were involved in an ICE operation that failed due to the interference of activists using Representative Ocasio-Cortez's materials. Can you describe what happened?" Mendoza nodded. "We had intelligence that a high-priority individual was at a residence. When we arrived, the neighborhood was already on alert. People had formed a human blockade around the property, shouting that we had no right to be there." Bondi paced slightly. "And what did they cite?" Mendoza exhaled. "They were reading straight from AOC's Know Your Rights pamphlet, stating that they should not open doors or answer questions." Gasps echoed through the room. Bondi turned to the jury, letting the moment linger. This was more than obstruction. This was incitement, and she was about to prove it. The crossfire intensifies. Bondi turned to the jury, her voice cutting through the courtroom's heavy silence. "And what was the outcome?" Officer Mendoza's jaw tightened. "By the time we gained access, the target was gone." A few gasps rippled through the audience. Bondi pressed on, her tone sharp. "So let me be clear. AOC's materials didn't just educate people. They directly led to the escape of a federal fugitive. Yes?" Mendoza gave a solemn nod. "Yes." Bondi let the moment stretch before finally turning back to her seat. No further questions. The defense strikes back. James Calloway rose from his chair, adjusting his tie as he approached the stand. His movements were slow, deliberate. "Officer Mendoza," he began smoothly, "you said the community blocked your access. Is that correct?" "Yes." Calloway nodded, his expression unreadable. "Did they attack you?" Mendoza hesitated. "No." Calloway tilted his head. "Did Representative Ocasio-Cortez personally tell them to block ICE?" Mendoza's lips parted, then pressed into a thin line. "Not directly, no." Calloway took another step forward. "Then, officer, are you blaming my client for people exercising their legal rights?" Mendoza frowned. "I'm saying she made our job harder." Calloway turned to the jury, his voice measured but firm. "Making law enforcement's job harder isn't a crime." He let the words hang in the air before stepping back. No further questions. A brewing storm. Bondi's lips pressed into a thin line. She needed a game changer. She turned to Caroline Levitt, who simply nodded. "Tomorrow," Levitt murmured, "we drop the real bombshell." The next witness. By morning, the courtroom was buzzing with anticipation. The tension was tangible. After the previous day's heated exchanges, both sides knew the stakes were rising. This was no longer just a political battle. This was personal. Judge Whitaker entered, bringing an immediate hush over the courtroom. He took his seat and slammed his gavel. "Court is now in session. Prosecution, your next witness." Bondi stood, her posture rigid, her gaze locked onto AOC. "The prosecution calls Frank Williams a former ICE agent." The room fell silent as Williams stepped onto the witness stand. He was an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in his ICE uniform. His expression was hard, his gaze unwavering. Bondi wasted no time. She stepped forward. "Agent Williams, can you describe the impact of Representative Ocasio-Cortez's actions on ICE operations?" Williams didn't hesitate. "Since the release of the materials from her office, resistance against ICE has escalated, not just in the form of protests, but in the way people are actively evading arrest. It has become significantly harder to locate and apprehend individuals with outstanding removal orders." Bondi nodded, turning toward the jury. "And how directly do you attribute this resistance to Representative Ocasio-Cortez's actions?" Williams's voice was firm. "Her materials, her public statements, they embolden people to resist. She has created an environment where law enforcement is seen as the enemy. And when people see us as the enemy, They refuse to comply. They run, they hide, and they make our jobs exponentially harder. Bondi's expression remained sharp. Can you provide any specific examples of these impacts? Williams gave a curt nod. In one instance, we attempted to arrest a known gang member with an active removal order. When we arrived at the location, a crowd had already gathered. They were holding signs, chanting, and openly reading from Ocasio-Cortez's Know Your Rights materials. We were forced to abandon the operation. A hush fell over the room. Bondi let the weight of his words settle before driving her point home. So would you say that Representative Ocasio-Cortez's materials directly led to a fugitive's escape? Williams nodded. Yes. Bondi turned to the jury. No further questions. The cross-examination. James Calloway rose from his seat, his movements methodical. His voice remained calm, almost too calm. Agent Williams, he began. You just testified that you were forced to abandon an operation. But let's clarify something. Did you have a judicial warrant? Williams's eyes narrowed. No. It was an administrative order. Calloway took a measured step closer. And isn't it true that without a judicial warrant, people have the right to refuse law enforcement entry into their homes? Williams shifted slightly. Yes. But that doesn't mean... Calloway cut in smoothly. That doesn't mean what, Agent Williams? That they exercise their constitutional rights? Williams clenched his jaw. Calloway turned to the jury, his voice unwavering. The prosecution wants you to believe that resisting a warrantless ICE raid is obstruction. But in this country, we have laws. We have rights. And Representative Ocasio-Cortez didn't create those rights. She reminded people they had them. He let the words hang in the air. No further questions. The room buzzed with whispered conversations. Bondi exhaled slowly, her eyes flicking toward Caroline Leavitt. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Tomorrow they would bring the hammer down. A battle over rights. Calloway's voice remained steady as he faced the jury. You're accusing people of doing what? Exercising their rights? He let the question settle before continuing. Ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about rights, we're not talking about breaking the law. We're talking about exercising the very protections that make this country free. Turning back to Williams, he asked, Did Representative Ocasio-Cortez ever tell people to break the law? Williams hesitated. No. Calloway nodded. So when she distributed her materials, was she advocating for anyone to break the law? Williams shifted in his seat. No, but... Calloway didn't let him finish. But she wasn't telling them to break the law, was she? Williams exhaled sharply. I suppose not. Calloway faced the jury. And isn't that the crux of this case? Williams hesitated, before muttering, I suppose. Calloway let the silence stretch. Then with a final glance at the jury, he said, No further questions. The tide's shift. Bondi clenched her jaw as Williams stepped down. Her case was solid, but Calloway was slowly chipping away at the foundation, one question at a time. She needed to finish this, and she needed to do it soon. Judge Whitaker rapped his gavel. We will recess for lunch. Court will reconvene in 1 hour. AOC turned to Calloway, her voice low. That was too close. We can't keep letting them chip away at the narrative. Calloway leaned back in his chair, a small smirk on his face. We're still ahead. Trust me. Across the room, Bondi sat with Caroline Leavitt. They're getting too comfortable, she muttered. Leavitt leaned forward, her expression calculating. We need to hit them harder. Bondi's gaze sharpened. Good. Make it happen. The final day. The morning of the final day in court arrived. The air was thick with anticipation. The courtroom was packed, tension palpable. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat at the defendant's table, her face calm, but beneath the surface, exhaustion weighed on her. She had fought tooth and nail, but the battle was nearing its end. The odds were stacked against her, and the reality of what was to come pressed heavily on her shoulders. This wasn't just about winning or losing. This was about her career, her future, the integrity of everything she had fought for. On the other side, Pam Bondi stood with quiet confidence. She had spent the last week relentlessly pressing her case, and now, the moment had arrived. She glanced at Caroline Levitt, who met her gaze with a knowing nod. Today they would seal the deal. Judge Whitaker entered, his face unreadable as he tapped his gavel. Court is now in session. Prosecution, you may call your final witness. Bondi rose, her voice firm and clear. Your Honor, the prosecution calls Dr. Richard Fox, an expert in law enforcement and immigration policy. A murmur rippled through the room as Dr. Fox, a tall man in his mid-50s with graying hair and a sharp gaze, stepped forward. He was a respected authority, and his presence added a layer of credibility to the prosecution's case. Dr. Fox took the oath. Bondi wasted no time. Dr. Fox, you've reviewed the materials distributed by Representative Ocasio-Cortez's office. What is your professional opinion on their content? Dr. Fox adjusted his glasses, his tone measured. The materials advocate for individuals to actively avoid law enforcement and resist detention. While they may be framed as legal advice, in practice, they can lead to obstruction of justice. Bondi stepped closer. Can you explain how the distribution of such materials could impede immigration enforcement? Dr. Fox nodded. When people are given information that encourages them to evade law enforcement, it undermines federal authority. It creates an environment of resistance, making enforcement significantly more difficult. Worse, it emboldens individuals to avoid arrest, even when they are under legal orders for removal. Bondi let his words settle before pressing on. So in your expert opinion, do these materials cross the line from legal education to obstruction? Dr. Fox didn't hesitate. Absolutely. They actively guide individuals on how to circumvent the law. Bondi turned to the jury, her voice unwavering. No further questions. A heavy silence filled the courtroom. The prosecution had made its final move, and now it was up to the defense to counter. The defense strikes back. James Calloway rose slowly, adjusting his glasses. He had been waiting for this moment. He had watched Bondi's strategy unfold piece by piece, but now it was time to mount the defense. He turned to the witness stand. Dr. Fox, Calloway began, his voice even. You stated that these materials encourage people to evade law enforcement. Tell me, did Representative Ocasio-Cortez personally instruct anyone to resist arrest or obstruct federal officers? Dr. Fox hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the directness of the question. No, she didn't personally instruct anyone to resist. Calloway nodded, stepping forward. So in your opinion, these materials might encourage resistance, but that doesn't necessarily mean they directly incite illegal action, correct? Dr. Fox shifted in his seat. I would argue that, given the political climate, these materials strongly encourage individuals to defy authority. But, Calloway interrupted, do they explicitly advocate for illegal activity? Dr. Fox opened his mouth, but Calloway didn't. Give him the chance. I think we can both agree, Dr. Fox, that teaching individuals about their rights is not a crime. In fact, it's a fundamental part of the American legal system. The right to remain silent. The right to refuse compliance. Without a judicial warrant, these are not loopholes. They are the very protections that keep this country free. He turned to the jury, his voice resonating through the courtroom. What we're talking about here is not incitement to criminal activity. It's the exercise of constitutional rights. If we start criminalizing the education of those rights, we don't just target individuals. We erode the very freedoms that define this nation. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Calloway turned back to Dr. Fox. No further questions. The turning point. Pam Bondi clenched her jaw, but said nothing. This was the battle she had been fighting all along, the war over public perception, and it was coming down to one final move. Judge Whitaker glanced between the attorneys. We will recess for lunch. Court will reconvene in 1 hour. AOC exhaled slowly, her hands gripping the table in front of her. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Every decision, every word, every movement mattered now. The narrative was slipping from her grasp, and she knew it. Across the room, Bondi and Caroline Levitt leaned in close. Their conversation was hushed, but the intent was clear. It's time to finish this. Levitt said, her voice calm, calculated. The final witness is ready. Bondi gave a single, resolute nod. Good. Make it happen. The media had already begun to spin the story. Headlines painted AOC as a radical, a lawbreaker. The tide was shifting, and soon Bondi would land the final blow. The final witness. When court reconvened, the air was electric with tension. Bondi rose, her voice steady. Your Honor, the prosecution calls our final witness, Tom Homan, former acting director of ICE. AOC's breath caught for just a moment. She had known this was coming. Homan had loomed over the trial like a shadow since the beginning. And now, he was here to deliver the prosecution's final strike. Homan strode into the courtroom with the confidence of a man who had already won. A familiar figure, his presence commanded the room. He took the oath, his gaze locking onto AOC as he settled into the witness stand. Bondi wasted no time. Mr. Homan, you have been at the forefront of immigration enforcement for years. Can you explain how Representative Ocasio-Cortez's actions have impacted your efforts to enforce the law? Homan's voice was strong, unwavering. Her actions have directly undermined our ability to enforce the law. When she publicly encourages people to resist ICE, it sends a dangerous message. It makes people think they can break the law without consequences. Bondi turned to the jury, her gaze unwavering. Mr. Homan, in your professional opinion, do Representative Ocasio-Cortez's actions constitute a violation of federal law? Homan didn't hesitate. Yes, she is actively obstructing federal law enforcement. And that is a crime. A sharp gasp rippled through the courtroom. The moment had arrived. Bondi didn't smile, but the gleam in her eyes said everything. The final blow had landed. The verdict. The courtroom held its breath as Judge Whitaker prepared to speak. After days of relentless testimony, after every argument, every cross-examination, every carefully placed word, the moment of truth had arrived. The jury deliberated. And then, the gavel slammed. Guilty of obstruction of justice, the judge declared. AOC's face went pale. The words hit like a crushing weight, pressing down with the force of finality. Bondi's victory was absolute. But the war was far from over. Because now, the battle for public opinion was just beginning.